Hi, this is Kevin at the Virtual Planetarium at Raritan Valley Community College. Welcome to our weekly Star Talk. Today we're going to be talking about things that we can't quite see with our eyes, but are still absolutely gorgeous regardless. But before we do that, let's talk about our upcoming moon phases. We have a first quarter moon on February 8th, we have a full moon on February 16th, and then we have a last quarter moon on February 23rd. Alright, so like I said, today we're going to be talking about things that we can't quite see with just our eyes, but they're still really pretty and they're a part of the winter sky, so I still want to share them with you all so that at least you know where they are, because some of these are famous nebulas and stuff that you've heard about, but maybe you don't know where it is in the sky. Now, we are currently looking at the Orion Nebula. If you don't remember how to find that, I'm going to put the link for our videos in the description of this one of how to find the Orion Nebula and how to identify each part. But right now, we're looking at Orion. We have Orion's belt right here in the middle, and then we have Orion's shoulders right here, and then Orion's knees right down here. And the first object we're going to look at is actually right in Orion's belt right here. So it is right by the first star of the belt, which is called Alnitak. And if we zoom into it, we see that right below there we have a fairly familiar object. This right here is the Horsehead Nebula. Again, it's right under the belt. It's actually a lot closer to the belt than I always remember, so that's pretty cool. And the Horsehead Nebula is a fairly famous nebula. It's something called a dark nebula, which means that it doesn't really emit any light or reflect any light. Instead, we can just see the silhouette of the nebula right here. And as we zoom in, you can see this more clearly because we have this red nebula in the background there. We'll talk about what that is later. But then we have this dark nebula right here just casting a shadow, casting a silhouette over that nebula. And that part right there is what looks like the horse's head, which is where the nebula gets its name, the Horsehead Nebula. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is not in the constellation of Orion, but we can use Orion to find this constellation. So we're going to zoom out a little bit more, and we are going to go to the constellation of Taurus the Bull. Now, as a reminder, you can find Taurus by following Orion's belt right here. If you draw a line upwards and to the right, we come to this reddish star right here, which is Aldebaran, or the Eye of the Bull. And then the whole constellation is just this V shape right here, and then it looks like the horns extend high up over the bull. And the horns are actually what we care about for this next object. And specifically, we're going to look at the horn that's directly above Aldebaran, or the one on the left. So if we were to zoom into this star right here, we notice that over here there's something a little interesting. Let me actually look up the actual object for you. And we come to something called the Crab Nebula. Now, the Crab Nebula is a supernova remnant, which is basically just a leftover from when a giant star exploded and went supernova. And it is right next to the horn of the bull right here. So if we zoom into it, again, it's not something you can see with just your eyes. You need a pair of binoculars and a clear night or a decent telescope to be able to see this. And again, this is called the Crab Nebula. Now, it gets its name because the first person that drew it kind of thought it looked like a crab, but it really still doesn't. Now, another cool thing about the Crab Nebula is that it's the first object recognized as being connected to a historical supernova. In the year 1054, there were reports of a bright star suddenly appearing in the sky by Chinese astronomers. They called and recorded this as a guest star, and it was actually bright enough to see during the day. Now, astronomers and historians were actually able to trace this back to that guest star right there. So that supernova explosion that happened in 1054 is what created the Crab Nebula right here, which is really, really interesting. Now, another cool thing about the Crab Nebula is that it's actually actively expanding. Here we have a really neat animation that spans about 10 years, and we can see movement within the nebula itself. And astronomers have been able to compare older pictures with the more recent pictures, and we can see that the nebula is actually actively expanding in that way as well. So that's very, very interesting. Alright, now we're going to go back to the constellation of Orion, and right next to Orion's brightest star, or his right knee right here, we have a fairly famous Halloween nebula. Right next to Orion, we have something called the Witchhead Nebula. This is something called a reflection nebula, which means that it doesn't actually produce its own light, and it doesn't block the light from anything else, but instead it's reflecting the light from a nearby star. In this case, it's reflecting the blue light from Rigel, which is why we see that this nebula, this giant cloud in outer space, looks a little bluish. And when you look at a picture, you can see why it gets its name. It really does look like a witch's head, and why, despite being in the winter sky, it's really more fitting for Halloween skies. So we like showing this in our Halloween shows because it's really fun. All right, now our next object is in a slightly less well-known constellation. It is actually a constellation right below Orion right here. We have the constellation of Lepus, which is supposed to be a hare. You can kind of see it. We have 2 ears right here, and then the body right down here, and the rest of the body over here. You know, the stick figure isn't the best, but it still kind of looks like a hare. And the object itself is not very well known. It's a very hidden gem, but it's actually one of my favorite things. Now, it's something called R-Lep, or R-Leporis, because it's in the constellation of Lepus, and the designation is the letter R. A better name for the star, though, is Hind's Crimson Star. And that's because this star is one that looks a very, very deep red when you look at it through a telescope. And that's because it's something called a carbon star. Now, these stars have an unusual amount of carbon in their atmosphere, which causes them to look a very deep red color because the carbon actually mixes with oxygen and turns into carbon monoxide, and then all the leftover carbon bends light in funky ways so that only the red light comes through a lot easier, and that's why it gets its deep, deep red colors. Now, it's not a easy target to find. I don't think you can even see it with binoculars, but if you have a telescope, you can check it out, or you can just look at pictures of it online. Because once you do find it, it is absolutely stunning. It just looks like a drop of deep red in a sea of stars, and I love it so much. And then the last thing we're going to show you today is the whole constellation of Orion, really. There's a lot of hidden gems that we've shown you today, but really, in Orion, just look at this picture. This is a 212-hour-long exposure of the whole constellation taken by Stanislav Volsky. And it is just an absolutely amazing picture. It's one of my favorite pictures out there. We can see the Orion Nebula right there below the belt. We can see the witch head next to Rigel down at the bottom right. We can see the Horsehead right below the belt. And then you can see this giant red loop that's going like around the bottom part of the constellation. And this is something called Barnard's Loop, which is a giant emission nebula. And an emission nebula is one that the gas is ionized, so it actually emits its own light. It's a very faint emission, but with a long exposure you can capture it, like here in this example right here. This giant nebula is actually part of the whole complex to which the Orion Nebula belongs to, so that's also really interesting that all these giant clouds are connected in outer space, so that's pretty neat. Alright, thank you so much for joining us today. Hope you learned something new. Again, sadly, these aren't really things that you can see with just your naked eye, so you'll need either a telescope, or you can use online telescopes too and try to find these cool objects, or just pictures of them online. And they're just a great way to show how there's so many hidden things in the sky that we can't really see with our eyes, but they're still breathtaking and absolutely gorgeous, so they're still worth it. If you like this video, be sure to give us a like, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our channel. Thanks again for joining us, and hope you have a great week.